Hello once again, everyone. It's me, the Hearth Guy, who returns from the abyss that I disappear into when you aren't watching me to deliver a follow-up to my last countdown. We like to say that there's no such thing as bad publicity. Yes, there is, and whoever said that first was a privileged douche who never experienced anxiety. There are few things in this world as potent as gamer rage, and I have been both a spectator and a propagator of it before. However, today at least, I want to set aside old grudges and look past the differences we have and consider that maybe we treated them a bit too harshly. Here's to hoping I don't get annihilated by the comments. This is the top 5 overhated bosses in video games. In the early days of RPGs, not all that was thrown at the wall worked. While some innovations stuck around long enough to become staples of the genre, that doesn't mean all was smooth sailing from the get-go. For this example, let's go back to one of the godfathers of JRPGs, Final Fantasy VII, the original. There are a lot of non-standard things in FF7 compared to modern RPGs of the same variety. Magic was based on items called materia, XP gain and materia usage was based on weapons, and the partially real-time turn system was something else entirely. Most frustrating for me was the optional characters, which are 100% missable just because you don't happen to check certain spots repeatedly or just aren't aware they exist at all. I still love the game, but come on, some kind of hint would have been nice. Well, there was one hint for the optional party member Vincent. You can find a single note in the Shinra mansion in Nibelheim about a mysterious Shinra soldier locked away somewhere in the manor. Following the notes, you will learn the code to the upstairs safe. After a bit of timed safe cracking, we can open the safe to find... What? For most everyone, Lost Number is a surprise, and generally an unwelcome one. It's honestly not hard to see why. Lost Number is impressively tanky for its location, and said location is already one of the most irritating in the game. Another point against it is the mechanics of the fight. Depending on whether the last attack dealt to it before its phase change is a magical or physical attack, it will change into a different form which is able to deal and has heavy resistances to said damage type. Meaning that, very possibly, it just went and became resistant to the primary form of damage that you rely on. Sure, you could mostly use magic and summons and happen to hit a physical attack at the last second to get the physical base second phase, but more likely that isn't what happened. Also, if you lose, you'll have to put in that timed code again, which can just be seen as being kicked while you're down. For the level you're likely to be at, Lost Number is a curveball. And what's worse is that unlike other optional bosses, this one is directly in the way of story content. Vincent. But you clicked on this video, you know what this list is about, so why do I think that it gets a bad rep despite that? To start, Lost Number's gimmick is actually a creative one, forcing you to be more fluid with your attack types if you weren't already. Going into the endgame, you aren't going to be able to get very far relying solely on magic or hitting stuff really hard. Now, it's unlikely that anyone is using only one or the other, but it's good that Lost Number exists regardless. It's also unique to play around with something like variant second phases so early. With most of its more creative bosses being the last couple of hours, it makes sense not to do too much with an optional boss like Lost Number, but they get creative. It's at the bottom of the list due to the fact that it is found in the most annoying area behind the most annoying puzzle. And while I think it does get more hate than deserved, that doesn't mean it isn't deserving of some hate. Ah well, you win some, you lose some. Now let me recruit Vincent already! Sometimes you find a boss that is equal parts loved and hated in the community it belongs to. And from the perspective of a hater, the boss is overrated. From the perspective of the lover, it's overhated. One of the reasons a list like this one and the last one are partially subjective is because it's up to me to decide what hate is or isn't justified. However, at least for once, I'm glad to have some allies who love a boss as much as I do. In this case, potentially one of the earliest skill checks in Hollow Knight, standing in front of what is likely to be many people's first dreamer, the Watcher Knights. The Watcher Knights used to be a group of warriors dedicated to protecting Lurien the Watcher, who dreams above the City of Tears. However, after unknown eons of watching, they all slowly passed away, leaving only their shells behind. Now, flies infected by the Radiance's power inhabit the cast-off shells of the Knights to attack the player as they try to reach Lurien's resting place. Its position is kind of the reverse of Lost Number, whereas Lost Number is lower because it deserves some of the spite it gets. This one is number 4 because there are those who do enjoy it despite the not-so-small group that doesn't. Hollow Knight is no stranger to throwing multiple bosses at you, but the Watcher Knights take it to a whole new extreme, with upwards of 5 knights that will come alive to attack, though only 2 at a time. They'll spin and swipe at you, and when both get rolling you can quickly find yourself with nowhere to stand in the boss arena. This going with 5 individual knights, and it's a real endurance match for potentially so early in the game. Due to how easy it is to reach the Watcher Knights as compared to either Monomon or Hera, they're more than often the first obstacle between you and a dreamer, and calling it a skill check is something of an understatement at this point of the game, especially since it's entirely possible and even likely to reach them without any extra mask or nail upgrades, so they can and will bash your face in without a second glance. I've seen people struggle for hours against the Watcher Knights, and it's not surprising that frustration turns to genuine distaste for the boss. Most anger towards Watcher Knights appears to be frustration directed at the boss's difficulty in relation to where it's placed in the game, but for me at least, that's the perfect place to put it. Considering how easy it is to get to the City of Tears, it'd be kind of anticlimactic if the very first dreamer you got was also a cakewalk. To be fair, there are bosses that are hated more than the Watcher Knights. Most of those bosses definitely deserve it more than these guys do. In my opinion, the Watcher Knights are one of the best boss fights in the game, and I'm not the only one who thinks so, hence why this is number 4 and not number 1 or something. Plenty of people recognize the quality in this boss fight, even if those who are still angry about them do exist and aren't quiet about it. It's actually in a roundabout way a testament to the Watcher Knight's quality that it made this list, because it is the fact that there are people who dislike it at all that is so baffling to me that made me put it in this spot to begin with. If it was a worse boss or the hate towards it was more downplayed, I'd probably have shoved it in honorable mentions and been done with it, but as it stands, I had to say something about the admittedly small amount of completely undeserved hate that the Watcher Knights get. Elden Ring, surprise surprise, has a lot of bosses. I feel like I've said that before. Many of these bosses are, unfortunately, copy-pasted normal enemies or rare enemies that you find frequently in the overworld. Bloodhound Knights, Kindreds of Rot, etc. Running into them over and over again really makes the mystique of these bosses and enemies wear off, at least to me. When I first fought a Bloodhound Knight, it was as a boss, and I thought it was the coolest thing. I began to wonder why this boss was specifically in this location and what that said about the story of the Bloodhound Knight. And then I find 3 others in random locations, and I'm starting to realize that maybe it wasn't as special an occurrence as I thought. Rinse and repeat this process over and over again and you get the picture. However, there was one set of bosses that never grew old to me, that sadly isn't looked upon in as much favor as a hefty chunk of the Elden Ring community. Enemies that reminded me of the good old days of Dark Souls 1, and the Black Knights that struck fear into every noob's heart. The Crucible Knights. The Crucible Knights are a sacred order in the world of Elden Ring, a group of warriors that channel the aspects of the primordial crucible of life. Some served Godfrey in the Age of the Erd Tree, others scattered across the lands between, but now with the land in ruin, they wander seemingly aimlessly. Your first encounter with a Crucible Knight is almost always brutal, with classic Elden Ring attack delays that have deceptive range along with abilities that are entirely unpredictable. Mix in the fact that each knight has a different combination of abilities and weapons, and they easily distinguish themselves as unique enemies that should, normally, be taken seriously. As for why people dislike them, it comes down to one thing: a distinct lack of parrying. Crucible Knights represent a second side to the Black Knight-styled enemies, where precisely timed parrying trivializes them to a point of outright bullying. Now, this isn't true all of the time. Some Crucible Knights throw a wrench into the works with their unique aspects of the Crucible, but that only adds to the fun for me. The unpredictability keeps every encounter with a knight fresh, and while some are woefully misplaced, the good heavily outweighs the bad for me. The ones that stand out to me are Crucible Knight Ordovis, who guards a tomb alongside one of their brethren, and Knight Siluria, who still follows the order of the Primordial Crucible, and drops one of the coolest lances in the game. Both are standout fights to me, even if Ordovis' encounter can border on a gank fight. But the awe that each Crucible Knight instills and the genuine respect I grew to have for them over the hours playing Elden Ring has resulted in me being simply incapable of disliking them. That's why, no matter what, whenever I see one of these guys, I get just a little bit excited. And then I die because I forgot to roll. Persona is no stranger to hated and aggravating bosses. Unlike, say, Okumura, for example, Most bosses in the series are both fun and creative, with a healthy dose of challenge when you aren't abusing and cheesing the system for all it's worth. Unfortunately, this isn't always recognized. Persona 4 isn't as recognized for the technical sides of its bosses, at least compared to the more popular Persona 5, but it'd be an exaggeration to say that they're outright hated. Usually. There are two exceptions. In my research for this video, I learned that there's an interesting dichotomy between Kunino Sagiri and Shadow Mitsuo. Different people hating one while liking the other. Sure, there are those who dislike both, but usually one was ranked significantly higher than the other. They were rarely right next to each other, which was peculiar because I like both of these boss fights. In fact, I would probably rank multiple bosses below them in this game. But for the sake of simplicity, I should probably just pick one. Since there seems to be less people hating Kunino Sagiri, then I have to give this slot to the 8-bit basement goblin not named Futaba. Near the midpoint of the game, this rando named Mitsuo takes credit for the series of kidnappings and murders in the sleepy town of Inaba, prompting our protagonist, the investigation team, to chase him down into my favorite level in the game, which is a retro-style castle in the 8-bit art style. Also in tune with that is Mitsuo's shadow, which is a literal man-baby with a big head who creates a fake armor around itself to make itself more powerful. Gee, I wonder what this could represent. Mitsuo's armor is the primary gimmick of the fight, as you need to destroy it to be able to do any actual damage against the much weaker inner body. However, said inner body will reform its armor over the course of a couple turns if not damaged enough to prevent this. While in its armored state, Mitsuo gets unique attack animations and effects reminiscent of the original JRPGs like Dragon Quest, and the hatred towards this boss seems to be stemmed from this dynamic. It can be frustrating trying to do damage when Mitsuo constantly regenerates that armor, and even without it, he's a real damage sponge. It doesn't help that Mitsuo has absolutely no affinity weaknesses and appears to be strong to physical attacks. This can lead to people spending upwards of 30 to 45 minutes just trying to whittle him down. But in my opinion, it acts as a good chance for you, the player, to get acquainted with buffs and debuffs. Up until now, you could probably get by with just figuring out what the boss was weak to and then spamming that over and over again to deal massive damage and then bum rush it. But Mitsuo intentionally stalls that strategy and forces the player to think creatively, utilizing abilities to increase your own stats while lowering his, so that even generally non-effective attacks can punch a hole straight through his defenses. Yes, Mitsuo can get rid of debuffs, but so can many bosses from here on out. Mitsuo acts as a harsh lesson that the next few bosses aren't going to pull their punches. They are going to use this game's mechanics to screw with you, so you better be smart and play tactically. The irony is that the best way to beat Mitsuo is to play like a real gamer. I'm not taking that back, I'm sticking with that one.
I have nothing. I am nothing.
The Crystal Sage, Dark Souls 3. A possible early game boss with a bit of a divisive second phase and run back that I personally don't mind. The clones can admittedly be a hassle, but they die in one hit and they'll teleport away if you get the real one to move as well, so it's not really that big of a problem. Alexei, Tales of Vesperia. A climactic showdown against what appears to be the big bad of the game, until that mystic art shows up and covers the entire screen. Yeah, it can be rough, but the rest of the fight is not that bad, guys. Come on. It's one attack. Just outmatch his aggression and don't get too defensive and you'll be fine. Xenoblade! Yeah, I know, I have a type, but this is important, trust me. In Xenoblade Chronicles 1, no, it's not the boss you're thinking about, early bosses don't tend to have a lot of fanfare. There's Zord, sure, but other than 2 scripted losses against Metalface, most big bosses of this part of the game are no-name monsters that rarely leave a huge impact. That is until we start to reach the highest parts of the Bionis, where the Telethia appear. Telethia are ancient guardians of the Bionis and act as something akin to an immune system for the sleeping titan. They can also read minds, which results in a continuous effect that makes you automatically miss any attack. Luckily for us, good old Alvis arrives to teach us how to use the Purge ability to negate this effect, and Melia eventually learns an ability that does the same. Fast forward to Chapter 8, and Melia, in order to receive the blessing of her father as his heir, must pass a trial in the High Entia tomb. However, our protagonist Shulk sees a vision thanks to the magical MacGuffin sword, the Monado, and sees Melia being attacked. Naturally, the team and Alvis leave to help her and save her mid-assassination attempt by an assassin employed by her stepmother. This is some Cinderella nonsense. The assassin Tyrea calls down to Telethia to help her kill you all. And this is where the fight begins. Short of a certain unnamed pain later on, which very much deserves all the hate it gets, this engaging duo boss gets an utterly unfair amount of frustration from those who have played Xenoblade Chronicles. With the swift, damage-dealing Tyrea acting as the DPS and the Telethia acting as the tank, this boss encounter forces you, the player, to adapt to the enemy using similar strategies as you. While the Telethia first forces you to attack it, and then uses Soul Read to prevent you from actually hitting it, Tyrea will unload combo attacks that are meant to topple you and then set up for higher damage, bind you and prevent movement, or to drain energy from your talent gauge and stall your own abilities. Meanwhile, the Telethia will also use abilities to instantly topple and daze your entire party, or simply cause topple, which sets up for Tyrea's higher damage-dealing abilities. This boss's design has an impressive level of synergy that doesn't border into full-on aggravation, at least for me. Clearly not everyone feels that way, but, Both bosses improve the other and makes the fight harder in a way that follows a logical process and can give you multiple options on how to approach it. Do you try to ignore the Telethia and deal with the damage-dealing Tyrea quickly, or do you do as the boss wants you to and focus on the Telethia, using the Purge and Mind Blast abilities to negate Soul Read and do actual damage? Do you try to pull an Uno Reverse and get your own tank to draw all their attention, or do you try to out-combo Tyrea with your own topple combos? This boss fight perfectly demonstrates what I love so much about duo bosses. By using two enemies that synergize well together, you can further promote creative thinking and allow you to try out new strategies that you may not have thought of beforehand. Which is why it puzzles me to see it looked down on. Have I just had an entirely different experience? Are we playing the same game? Yes, it's challenging. Yeah, Telethia are by definition a pain to fight, but all it takes is a decent party and you can have an answer to every problem that the boss puts against you. Regardless of what others think, this is, at least to me, a well-designed and far overhated boss that deserves as much appreciation as we can give it. Thankfully, Tyrea gets a much-needed redemption arc later. After we blow up her sky whale.
Almost bought it. Alvis, thank you.
My pleasure, Shulk.
Thank you once again for taking the time to listen, and I hope you'll consider liking and subscribing for more content. I like to branch out and make videos on just about everything I can think of, so there's sure to be a little bit of something for everyone. For my next countdown, I'm going to try my best to make even more people angry at me. It's one thing to say good things about stuff people hate. How about saying bad things about stuff people love? Ooh, boy, that's going to be a fun one. If you want to see that mess, then I'll see you all next time around the hearth.